Blog Talk Radio.
All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Yaron and Amy show. We haven't one. Oh, well, we did one last week, so it hasn't been that long. Happy Election Day. Did you go vote, Amy?
Do you know that I did not?
Oh, you're like in a swing county, aren't you? Isn't it close?
I can't get motivated to vote for either of the creatures.
Who's your rep? Do you know?
Well, yeah, I don't really talk about that.
Oh, okay. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. She's in an undisclosed location.
That's right.
Yes. I can't sure if it's close or not where you are, but anyway. I'm in Puerto Rico. So, Puerto Ricans don't get to vote. That's one of the advantages, I guess, of being in Puerto Rico is you only get a vote in the local elections. And that's going to be fun when it happens.
I'm spending a lot of time on my sick doggy. So, yeah.
Oh, that's too bad.
She's actually doing better. I think that maybe the cancer discovery was a bit of a fluke and I might have some serious time with her still. So we'll see.
Good. That'll be nice. As long as she's not.
Yeah, she's doing well now, so it's good. But yeah, Election Day, I put in the program notes, which you can find over at don'tletitgo.com, the Arcadia song called Election Day. I don't know if you ever knew that one back from the 90s or whatever. And I put in there, just because this is just the big midterm elections, I put what we call the extendo mix from hell, because only the extendo mix from hell can do these midterms justice, right? Because, the world is going to end basically depending on how this comes out, right, Yaron?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if either party takes control of the House or either party takes control of the Senate,
right,
it's the end of civilization as we know it.
Yes.
Depending on who you listen to. And we'll get to that. We want to talk about the Paul Krugman piece. But before that, let's make some predictions. What the hell?
Are you really going to do that? Sure. I thought you were joking.
Oh, no.
Okay.
We're gonna predict who's gonna win Kentucky.
How are you gonna compete with that 538 guy?
I'm reading 538.
Oh, okay. You can't beat them, join them. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah. No, I've got. I know this is. Don't tell anybody, but I've got the New York Times website here with a big map that is telling me who's winning what. But don't tell anybody.
You find the New York Times useful? How could you find the New York Times useful? Because, they're horrible.
And I've got five, of course, 538 missed the Trump victory last election. But of course, they had him with a relatively high probability of winning. It just wasn't a majority. So, that's the nature of probability. Sometimes something that's less than 50% actually is successful. If it was never successful, it would be 0%. The fact that it has a positive probability of success. So I'm going to make this prediction, and within an hour or two, I could be proven dramatically wrong. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to make this prediction, and that is that Republicans will do better than the mainstream media thinks they will do. That I don't think this is going to be as big of a Democratic sweep as many Democrats think it is. I still think the Democrats will win the House because it's just too easy. And in midterm elections where there's no presidential election, usually the party in opposition, the party not in the White House, almost always, I think it's like 80 to 90% of the time, gain significant amounts of seats. And they don't need to gain that much in order to take the House. I think Republicans probably gain a seat or two in the Senate, but that is a failure for Republicans because going into this election, let's say 2 years ago, before it was clear Trump was president, the expectation was that this year, Republicans could conceivably get to 60 senators because there's a bunch of Democratic senators in red states that are running for re-election. There are very few Republicans running for re-election. Most of the map is Democrats, and a lot of them are in red states. So Republicans should win them. So I think they might gain one or two. So generally, I think it won't be. I don't think it would be a huge blue wave. Although, somebody says, I agree with you, Ron, no blue wave, no disaster. I don't think a blue wave would be a disaster. It would be tough for Trump, but I don't consider something tough for Trump to necessarily be a disaster. Republicans are not doing anything with their control of the House and the Senate. Did they repeal Obamacare? Wait.
It's so funny. What was it? Krugman was saying that for sure, if they keep control of the House of the Senate, they're going to repeal Obamacare.
Yeah,
right.
That's one of the ridiculous things about. So the very few people in the world I love to hate or hate to hate or whatever the term is, more than Paul Krugman. I mean, yes, I rile on Donald Trump all the time, but after all, he's president. And Paul Krugman is just a former economist. He used to be an economist. Now he's a political hack, paid and bought for by anything that is democratic. Paul Krugman is also, he's forgotten all his economics. He contradicts his own textbook on economics regularly. He contradicts his own essays that he won a Nobel Prize for economics regularly. Paul Krugman is a hack, and he is a power-lusting. If anybody is close to being an Ellsworth Toohey, Paul Krugman is that type of person. I don't think he's quite as sophisticated and self-aware probably as Ellsworth Toohey was, but he is close. So I despise Paul Krugman. I read Paul Krugman periodically for the entertainment value. Plus, he mentions Ayn Rand a lot, so I'm always thankful to Paul for mentioning Ayn Rand. That definitely is nice. So I thought we'd go through this op-ed that Amy found that Paul Krugman wrote, I guess today. It was published today in the New York Times. Oh, the New York Times.
Actually, no, it was published yesterday, but I just knew. I was like, Yaron's got to analyze this because it will be fun.
Yeah. So this is an op-ed that illustrates the extent to which what I've been saying, or we've been saying for a long time now, years really, that is the tilt towards emotionalism, the tilt towards tribalism and emotionalism. And the whole idea here is to use emotions to rally your base, to use emotions to get people riled up. Forget facts, forget reality, forget the truth, forget what's really going to happen. The only thing, and this is right out of Donald Trump's playbook, the only thing that matters is winning. Nothing else matters. So you say whatever is necessary to win.
Preferably to stoke fear in people.
Yes. Well, it turns out that fear is a great motivator in winning. That is, people respond to fear. And I think that's probably true, unfortunately, in the world we live in, that people respond to fear more than they do to the positives.
Marketing people say that all the time, and it's just sad.
Yeah, I mean, take Donald Trump, for example, just to mention something about Trump. Leading up to this election, Trump could have emphasized the wonderful economic numbers that he has, that unemployment is really low, that GDP is growing relatively fast, that things are going well economically. And he mentions that, but he doesn't make a big deal out of it. What does he make a big deal out of? He makes a big deal out of the caravan. He makes a big deal out of all the evils he can see in the potential Democrats winning. So the whole motivation is fear, and because people respond to fear. People don't respond to love, because talking about the positives, people don't respond to positives. The positives, yeah, we know the economy's doing well, but we're going to be invaded. But, the Democrats are coming, they're going to kill everybody, they're going to kill this recovery. So the motivation, both on the left and on the right today, is primarily through fear, primarily through the negative, primarily through hate, not through the positive and through love. And Paul Krugman's op-ed illustrates this perfectly. So we'll start in paragraph 1 of the op-ed. We're just going to read this op-ed. You can find a link, actually paragraph 2. You can find it on Amy's blog, where she's got a link, but it's yesterday's New York Times, if you want to go.
Yeah, don'tletitgo.com is the link to the program notes, right?
Yeah. So here's, he says something in the first paragraph that's not that important, but then he says, it's a near certainty. The Democrats will receive more votes than Republicans, with polling suggested a margin in vote cast for the House of Representatives of 7 or more percentage points, which would make it the biggest landslide in modern times. Now, notice here that we don't know. I mean, yes, that's what polling suggests, but polling suggested, which he doesn't say, usually overestimates these kind of successes. It's probably projected a landslide in the past, which hasn't turned out to be true. So there's no attempt to kind of moderate this based on history, because the point of this is not that Democrats are going to win. The point is in the next sentence. The point is this. However, gerrymandering, and other factors, parentheses, Yaron saying, not to be mentioned, right?
Right, because they would have to be scrutinized if they were mentioned. Right?
Well, and also those factors might be rational. They might make sense. It might be, for example, that, that where Democrats win, they win by huge margins, like in certain places in California, like in New York. Where Republicans win, they win by smaller margins. So even though Democrats, it's just the way the system works, even though Democrats might win by large margins of the popular vote, they still might not win the actual seats in Congress because that's the way the system goes. But gerrymandering and other factors, which might not be manipulative, but the implication is it's manipulated. Mm-hmm. And other factors have severely tilted the playing field, made it unfair. But he doesn't mention what the other factors are. Usually, if you say et cetera, like other factors, you mention 2 or 3, and then you say and others, right? Because you don't want to list a whole list. But you mention one, you don't then say one and then et cetera, right? You mention a few, but he won't mention.
And you mentioned gerrymandering, which is already sounds suspicious to people.
Well, I mean, I agree with him. Gerrymandering is real, and Republicans. The maps for the House of Representatives were drawn in 2011, where basically Republicans controlled almost a huge number of state houses and governorships. So they did gerrymander. Some of that's gone to the Supreme Court. Some of it's gone to federal courts. Democrats do the same thing when they get control. But in this case, 2011 was a great year for Republican. It came after the 2010 elections, which swept into, after Obama won in 8, the Republicans took the House and the Senate and the state houses in 2010. So yes, there was gerrymandering, but everybody does it. But I'm focusing on the other factors because he's implying here there's a lot going on that's scheming that's going to do. So he says it might not be enough to bring control of the chamber. So he's setting it up with Democrats might not win the House, right? So beware.
Even though the popular vote, it's all about. Yeah.
Of course, because everybody's a Democrat, but they just get screwed every single time. Like Hillary won the popular vote, but Donald Trump was elected. Exactly. Put aside that's not how elections in the United States are run. It's not about the popular vote. Never has been. They keep bringing this up to pretend that they have the majority and therefore that it's important. And then he says, then he talks about
Democrats do climb that tilted slope. Anyone expecting Republicans to accept the result with good grace hasn't been paying attention. So it's going to be, even if they manage to do it, then the Republicans, boy, they're just going to make war over this. Yeah.
And then he says, but ugly as the scene will be if Democrats win, it will be far worse if they lose. End of the world stuff here, guys. In fact, it's not hyperbole to say that if the GOP holds the line on Tuesday, it may be the last even halfway fair election you'll ever have. That's it, people. If Republicans win the House of Representatives, world as we know it will end. Now, I'm not, as you know, a big fan of Republicans. I'm certainly not a big fan of this administration. And we've talked about the moves towards authoritarianism. But really, this election, this is it, in the House. This is going to determine whether we still have democracy in 2 years or we don't, or whether it's completely gone and there's never going to be a fair election again.
I would say, Yaron, that it's not hyperbole to say that any sentence that starts with "it's not hyperbole" is hyperbole.
I think that's usually the case, certainly when it's Paul Krugman saying it. But it truly is amazing to me, just that kind of hysteria. And he goes on further on. Now, then he talks about
this is the thing, right? He goes on to talk about the individual situations in which Republicans maybe have done something shady. You don't know for sure, but at least there's some evidence, right? And then somehow that means that all GOP who are in power everywhere are going to do some shady things and he gives only 3 examples. So he gives Kemp in Georgia, right? And then he gives some other things that have happened in 2
kind of says Kansas
states.
and North Dakota without really giving the
not giving much details, right?
And it just means people were told they need a different color ink in their pens, as if that is this voter fraud. But he also doesn't mention, give me a break. I mean, Illinois, Chicago, what Democrats do in Chicago, what Democrats do in Illinois. I mean, there's a lot of historical evidence, at least, that, and maybe Democrats are not this corrupt anymore. I doubt it. But, that Kennedy probably won because of vote rigging in Illinois in 1960. And, the whole Daley machine. And so give me a break, right? I mean, yeah, it's not good when Republicans are rigging the system, but there's no evidence that Republicans are rigging the system, as far as I can tell, any more than Democrats have.
Yeah, and how collectivist is like, okay, well, here are a few Republicans who maybe have rigged the system. And so therefore, if the GOP is in power, all of them are going to be rigging the system, because anybody who's in the same political party as people who have rigged the system will themselves, of course, rig the system.
Yep. Yeah.
What kind of logic is that?
Well, somebody on YouTube says, when Paul Krugman says it's not hyperbole, rest assured it is hyperbole. Something like that. Anyway, whatever Paul Krugman says, bad, right? And then he says, of course, this I find funny. Trump is nonetheless engaged in extraordinary abuse of power in the run-up to the vote. Now, you guys know what I think about deploying soldiers to the border, but this is nuts coming from a Democrat. He says he deployed large military force to the Mexican border at a likely cost to taxpayers of hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, I had to take a step back. Paul Krugman cares about how much something costs to the federal government. I mean, if anything, this is going to stimulate the border economies, because the government is spending hundreds of millions of dollars. This is stimulate economic growth.
An awesome broken window.
Mexico and Texas. This is Paul Krugman talking, and he's worried about how much money is going to be spent on a government program. Give me a break. This is a guy who wants to spend trillions of dollars more on a variety of government programs. And, and then what has this got to do? Now, I agree. If he had said that that Trump is doing this in order to rile up people in order to go vote, then I agree with them. Whether it's a blatant misuse of power of the presidency.
Well, I mean, he does.
What's the political advantage?
He does imply that, right? Because he says it's an obvious attempt to hype the supposed threat from a small, bedraggled caravan of refugees still more than 700 miles away. And I do think that there is no
question. That's absolutely. I'm going to say it. Paul Krugman is absolutely right about that. Okay, one sentence in a whole op-ed. This is not bad. So yes, there's no question that Trump has done this purely, 100%, to hype people's fear so that they go vote. And indeed, if you look at exit polls, immigration is like a top issue of concern for people exiting the polls. So, I'm telling you, Kentucky 6, the Democrat is leading by 5%. So I might be wrong. If Kentucky 6 goes Democratic, then this could be a Democratic wave. But that's early, and that's all. Here's my punditry, guys. Here's me doing what do you call the guys who? But that's most of the votes are coming in from what's the capital of Kentucky, or what's the main city in Kentucky?
So Louisville, or? No,
it's not Louisville. It is Lexington. So most of the votes here are coming from Lexington. Lexington's a university city. It's a Democratic city. Mm-hmm. So because the early votes are being counted from Lexington, you can expect the Democrats to lead in the beginning. But then the question is, can the Republicans catch up? But the 6 is supposed to be a bellwether for the rest of the country. We'll see. How that was pretty good. I could go on like Fox and CNN and give commentary on these things.
Parade in front of the electric maps and point at things.
You're a favorite at Fox. You can still let them know how good I am at these things. All right. He goes on to say, listen to this now again. And again, this is from me, who is pretty critical of Donald Trump, or very, very, very critical of Donald Trump. The lesson we learned from all these abuses of power is that today's Republicans are just like the fellow white nationalists. So again, today's Republicans are just like their fellow white nationalists in Hungary and Poland, who have maintained a democratic facade, but have in reality established one-party authoritarian regimes. Now, I think that Donald Trump is very much like the authoritarians in Hungary and Poland, but I don't believe today's Republicans are yet. And I think that generally our system of checks and balances is still working to restrain, at least to some extent, Trump's more authoritarian impulses. But to compare it to Hungary and Poland, where there's, particularly Hungary, where there's no independent news media anymore, where it is completely dominated by one party, where again, names don't come to me. That's age, I guess. You know, and even Hungary, we're moving in the direction of Hungary and Poland, but to just throw out their fellow white nationalists is quite something. And not just about Donald Trump. I could kind of maybe be sympathetic if you did it about Donald Trump, but really? All of them?
All of the GOP, yeah.
Republicans? Now, right, I think it's a little much, right?
The last chance to stop them from locking in permanent rule.
Permanent rule. So notice this. If Republicans win today, they will win forever. Permanent rule, one-party system, just like in Hungary. I don't think even Hungary and Poland, I don't think Poland is yet a one-party system, but Hungary is certainly moving in that direction. All right, and then he goes on. So notice just the hysteria. Okay, so then he says, well, the Democrats have run this honest campaign, right? They basically run a campaign on issues. They haven't used, and the main issue is healthcare. And he says, if Republicans hold the House, because they'll finally repeal the Obamacare and will soon go after Medicare and Medicaid. Now, there is exactly zero evidence of any of that. The House under Republicans repealed it. The Senate didn't. Even the House repeal was not a real repeal. It was kind of a mishmash, not really repeal. And the Senate doesn't have, you need 60 votes to repeal Obamacare, and the Republicans don't have 60 votes. So there's no way, and they're not going to get 60 votes. So there's no way the Affordable Care Act can be repealed by, even if the Republicans win. And then Republicans have shown no interest, zero, zilch, nothing. I wish this was not true to go after Medicare and Medicaid. I wish they would go after Medicare and Medicaid.
But he's threatening that. But, you know, he is bringing up an interesting issue in these last paragraphs, which is that he's saying that the ordinary voter is more easily moved by issues that have a direct impact on their well-being than by the more abstract concerns about democracy and rule of law, which it echoes a lot of the experience that I've had out there. So I don't know if we're gonna have to say that Krugman is right again about something, but I've had the experience that when I express concerns, for example, last week, right, we were talking about Trump fueling the conspiracy mentality, which is behind anti-Semitism, right?
Yep.
And my concern, I don't call Trump an anti-Semite. And people kept saying I was calling him an anti-Semite. I was not calling him an anti-Semite. They were very focused on that concrete. I am focused more on the fact that he appeals to fear, that he encourages a conspiracy mentality, that he is grabbing and holding on to executive power. And you could say, well, Obama did it and he's just doing what Obama did. But he has a choice about whether or not to continue to expand executive power. It's those rule of law and more abstract issues that I'm concerned with. But maybe Krugman's right. You know, most people, the ordinary voter, as he calls them, is more easily moved by the more concrete issues of healthcare, immigration, whatever. What do you think?
I mean, to some extent that's true, but at the end of the day, it is abstract ideas that shape the electorate. So people don't vote their pocketbook. For example, I mean, the economy is doing well right now. Based on just the economy, you would expect Republicans to have a huge day today, winning, you know, controlling the House and winning majorly. No, but people are voting also on the character of Donald Trump. People are voting on their expectations of the future, but people are also voting on, you know, their more abstract beliefs. And even Republicans, as I mentioned earlier, are not voting so much on, wow, look what a good job Donald Trump has done for the economy. They are voting much more about, oh my God, the caravan is going to invade. And if the Democrats win, we'll get open immigration, as if Democrats actually want open immigration. So it's, again, motivated by more of the fear than it is of any kind of positive value or the good things that are going on in their life. All right, so let's finish up the Krugman op-ed. And at the end of the day, ideas shape the world, and the ideas of I think at the end of the day, Democrats are more consistently altruistic. So when it comes to things like healthcare, they win the debate. And
the reason that is because even the GOP now is saying, oh, well, don't worry, we're not going to take away coverage for pre-existing conditions. In other words, we're going to keep trying to square the circle.
What happens is because everybody's an altruist, the Republicans have to become Democrats. So they continuously on these kind of issues move to the left steadily. Okay, this is interesting. This I found interesting. He says, and until very recently, mainstream news media berated Democrats who were running on nothing but opposition to Trump, which was never true. But the media said it anyway, which is I find interesting. The left hates the mainstream media almost as much as the right does. They think, people like Paul Krugman, Elizabeth Warren, certainly Bernie Sanders, think that the media is way too right-wing, if you can believe that. And it's fascinating to me because it's always the case. Whenever I meet real lefties, they say, oh, the media, they're dominated by the right. They're corporatists, right? They're all owned by corporations. So they're dominated by the right. So I find it interesting that he thinks that the media is too right-wing, too Republican. And then at the end he says, but with the crucial moment here, everyone should bear in mind what's at stake. It's not just tax cuts or health coverage, and anyone who votes based simply on those issues is missing the biggest story. For the survival of the American democracy is on the ballot, right? So if you don't vote Democratic, you're voting against the survival of freedom in America.
Yeah.
All right, that's Paul Krugman, but it's just consistent. Everything the distortion of facts, the hysteria, the fear mongering is what we've come to in the world in which we live. I mean, that has become typical and tragic that, it's all about fear, and it's all about.
I think the worst part of that op-ed is that so-called induction he wants to lead the reader through, which is, here are a few examples of maybe arguable corruption in the GOP trying to manipulate the vote. And so therefore, if GOP wins, they're just going to take control permanently, manipulate.
Well, and of course, they're going to cut taxes.
Fair election ever.
And they're going to cut taxes and destroy healthcare as we know it. And it can't be anything worse than that. And it's pretty amazing that he can get away with writing an op-ed like that. I mean, if somebody had submitted me an op-ed like that, just in terms of the quality of writing and the quality of the logic, I would have thrown it back in their face if I was an editor. But this is what Paul Krugman does. This is pure propaganda, and it's junk. And of course, the right does exactly the same thing. So I'm just picking on Krugman because he's prominent in the New York Times, and it was published yesterday. And Amy referred it to me. So, but we could have taken anything from the right.
I just figured, it would be too early. It'd be too early to make any real predictions. Of course, I was wrong because you are trying to maybe make some. But I figured if we can't make predictions, at least we can look at Krugman's claim that the world was going to end.
So the real time forecast right now is Republicans' chance of keeping the House is about 15%. And Republican chance of keeping control of the Senate is about 88%. So It looks like the Senate will stay Republican and the House will shift Democratic. And there doesn't seem to be anything in the early results, all over the place to suggest otherwise. But we'll see. I mean, it's still
and if that happened, it would essentially mean gridlock, which could be a good thing.
Yeah, but it's not like a lot was getting done.
Sure.
Right? So it's not like the House and the Senate and Trump were passing a lot of legislation. Very little legislation was passing. So, I mean, that's part of the disappointment with having, on the things that they could do something about, they don't do anything. So they didn't repeal Obamacare. They haven't deregulated from a legislative perspective. Trump has deregulated to some extent at the regulatory agency level, but not through legislation. Right. They haven't really, through legislation, done very much. The budget increased spending, so it could have been the Democrats. So I'm not sure what gridlock buys us. I think, given that I think what's happened over the last couple of cycles is that the House of Representatives and the Senate have lost immense power, which has gone to the executive. So the president now is significantly more powerful than he was 50 years ago. And the House and the Senate are significantly less powerful than they were 50 years ago. And we've seen a shift in the balance of power, which I think is tragic, because I think this founders set it up very carefully to make sure that the executive didn't get too much power. But I think we are beyond that, so that under Bush and then Obama and now Trump, the executive has way, way too much power in American politics.
By the way,
basically impotent.
I was going to say, to plug New Textbook of Americanism, to which you and I have contributed, that was published by Jonathan Honig recently.
Yep.
In the back of it, there's some Q&A with Ayn Rand on politics. And one of the topics that she talks about there is the issue of checks and balances. And it's some good stuff. So,
and the real importance of them, and why it's objective, why it's crucial for objectivity to have those kind of checks and balances. And yeah, and we're moving far, far away from those checks and balances. People want a Republican court, right? Not a court of good judges who can act, but a Republican court. Kavanaugh was a Republican candidate. Arguably the guy before him, what's his name?
Gorsuch.
Gorsuch was just a good judge.
Gorsuch wrote a good Fourth Amendment opinion, so he earns high marks in my book just for that.
Yeah. No, I think on other issues he's good as well. But Kavanaugh was a political appointment. And so the more you move into that, anyway, let's dump politics.
Yay.
Except towards the end, we will see if my prediction about the Kentucky, I don't know what prediction I actually made, but whatever prediction there is, we'll see what happened to Kentucky 6th.
Yeah. I mean, if you're right, then the margin that's going for Democrats should decrease as we continue on with the show, because
because
they're going to bring in precincts other than
by then. We won't know California by the time.
No. But I'm saying that in terms of Kentucky, maybe the margins are going to
we'll
shift. So let me set this up, right? Because in my inbox this morning, by the way, this graphic, before people are hyperventilating or whatever, that somehow I made a graphic with profanity.
Yeah. You're not
I did not make this graphic.
Yeah, but you're not supposed to use graphics with profanity.
You can never share a graphic with profanity, even if it was good at raising a discussion issue.
You can, but not on my show.
Oh.
I'm a.
Well, then I quit right now.
There you go.
If that's it. No. So I didn't make this graphic. It was sent to me by GFDA, which is Good Fucking Design Advice. That's the name of the company. So sorry, but that I said it. But no, I didn't make it. I learned about this company because Johnny Ive had a poster of theirs in his office, right? Yeah. And so it's motivational stuff. Essentially, I call it profane horoscope material. It's vague and stuff, and it's supposed to be motivational. And this is the one that I got in my inbox this morning on the one day that you and I have planned for this entire month, because you're so busy and everything, to do a show together, work together as a fucking team, right? And then what are they saying about me? Because, I come up with titles and stuff without even consulting you, right? And here's what they say. They say, have some fucking humility. Your dumb ass can't do this alone. So I was thinking, God, maybe I should consult Yaron about the titles before I post them. Is that what they're telling me? Is GFDA telling me that I just make bad titles?
I don't know.
Anyway, so I post this. It's fun, and
people are harassing you already for the effort.
And rile you up a little, huh?
So people are harassing you on Facebook already.
Well, only in your group, in your show group. Everybody else was getting a good laugh about it. But actually, I did get one bit of harassment, though, which was, isn't this about as non-objectivist as it comes, basically, to exhort people to work together in a team? In other words, to promote teamwork. And so I figured it would be worth visiting the concept of teamwork. I think we may have talked about it before, but is teamwork, that concept of teamwork, inherently collectivistic and somehow not individualistic to talk about teamwork?
I'm not going to say it. People encouraging me to say it. No. No, of course not. Of course, teamwork is individualistic. I mean, teams are just another mechanism in which we interact with one another in a win-win trader relationship type environment. And, good teams are teams which are constructed to reinforce the strengths of the individual members of the team. A great team is a team that has that everybody on the team is an independent thinker. But even an independent thinker can benefit from input from another person. So while there's no such thing as groupthink, there's no such thing as collective consciousness, there is the ability of one individual to improve the thinking of another individual. There is the ability of one individual to show another individual or to nudge another individual to see something he wouldn't otherwise see, to provide him with facts that he wouldn't have, to broaden his context, to help him focus. So no, we help each other all the time, including helping each other in thinking, not in the literal act of thinking, but in the provision of facts, evidence, data, and in the ability, in the context of doing it. So there is nothing, zero, zilch, collectivist about teamwork. Teamwork is just a group of individuals on a voluntary basis engaging and working with one another in a trader win-win relationship in order to, as a group, achieve a particular target, a particular goal. That could be a corporation. It could be a soccer team. It could be a basketball team. It could be, any of these. It could be any association of people working together to achieve something. It could be even in art, right? A sculptor sculpts in clay, but then he needs a team of people who help him cast it into bronze. And so in every field of human endeavor, there are going to be teams that help one another and enforce one another. And the successful ones are teams of individuals. It's not some members are leeching off others. It's not, people have to contribute to a team their own independent thought. Otherwise, they're kicked out of the team.
Yes. And I, a few years ago, interviewed John Allison, who had been the CEO of BB&T. And I think he met with a little bit of controversy over this, but when he, had his brochure, BB&T Values, and he would talk about the values that he would promote within his company. Of course, one of them had to be teamwork. If you're going to have a huge, successful banking firm, it's going to have to include a lot of people working together as teams in different departments and things like that. And I remember that we talked explicitly about teamwork. It is essential to achieve certain types of goals for people to work together successfully on teams. Now, that being said, GFDA, calls me a dumbass. What in the world? You can't do this alone. No, but I mean, I think that they're a little bit too critical of the individual. It's not that you are a dumbass in any way, shape, or form. It's just that there are certain things that you can do better with the assistance of somebody else. I mean, even writers, you need an editor typically. Even if you have all the time in the world to take a piece of writing and then set it aside and come back to it fresh, you're not going to see the things that somebody else could see reading it and editing it for you. Some of the most individual endeavors that you could think of could nonetheless benefit from a feedback of somebody else who's able to provide valuable input.
Absolutely. In every human endeavor, we're not in isolation, and there's a massive value to other human beings. Again, because of the trader principle, because of the specialization, because of the division of labor, and because of the spiritual value that other people represent. So it's fun to work in teams because other people represent, good people represent real values, and it increases the fun of actually engaging in work. So objectivists would think that being an individualist means working in isolation. Now, given that, I will say this: to really do hard thinking, to really do the really hard stuff that's involved in you have to do by yourself. You have to have quiet. If you're writing an editorial, if you're writing a book, if you're preparing for a speech, that can't be done. Real intellectual work is done alone. It's done. I mean, it's inspired by lots of sources and people and books and everything. But at the end of the day, when you're doing the work, you know, it's just like coding, right? When you code, you have to code. You in the computer.
It's funny because you mentioned the word quiet and you also mentioned coding. And there is a book by a woman named Susan Cain called Quiet. And I was consulting it when I was putting together my course on privacy some years ago. And she talked about the fact that the current trend in designing offices, which is to have all of this open plan stuff. And as far as I know, the open plan has now been exacerbated because of the Me Too movement, and everybody wants to have completely open glass doors and everything, which, you know, try to feel like you have any sort of privacy to just sit there and get your brain wrapped around something when that's going on. But yeah, they've done studies. Coding and everything else requires solitude. Solitude, yeah.
And look, so there are activities that teams are necessary for, the team that you benefit from teams, and then there are activities that require, you know,
solitude. Yeah.
Solitude.
Yeah, I mean, typically it's different phases of work, right? So you need, each person needs to go work on their part of the thing and then bring it together and see what can, you know, come from the feedback and everything, and then maybe go back and do their own thing again for a bit. But no, the team is not a bad word inherently at all.
Yep.
And just wanted to reinforce that, as it's not a collectivist concept to promote teamwork. It's one, I guess, that could be taken the wrong way. You know, in business schools, it's notorious that there's so much, quote, group work. And the stories that I always hear is that there's slackers within the group almost.
Always. I mean, when I was in business school, we did group work, and it was one or two people who did all the work, and you always have slackers, and that's true in businesses and everywhere. And part of what the virtue of justice in a business means is to separate the people who really did the work from the slackers. And somebody said it's better to work alone than to work with a bad team. Absolutely. You know, having a bad team it really is pretty disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you know, a show like what we're doing here, right? So we do back and forth, and there's certain things that can come out of a discussion back and forth, even though you can do 2 hours all by yourself, no problem. And people are happy to listen to what you have to say. There's still, I think, the value of the back and forth sometimes, as long as both people are intellectually active and have something to contribute and their own perspective on issues as well. So,
I mean, I think the whole controversy over teamwork is I mean, people who think that teamwork is not individualistic just don't understand objectivism, don't understand life, and don't understand what it means to pursue values and the fact that rational individuals are not in conflict with one another. That is that human life, we're not in conflict with one another. That's not the essence of life. So I really don't I don't know who holds this idea that teamwork is non-individualistic or anti-objectivist, but whoever they are, they're super rationalists.
It may have been raised as a joke, but I was quickly saying, this would be a great show topic.
Did we go into feminism?
Yeah, let's talk about feminism, because this is another topic that has been discussed a lot recently. I have been criticized for allowing Tucker Carlson to call me a feminist on a couple of the different appearances. You know, this came out by accident at first.
Yeah, I know.
It came about by accident because I was referred to him by Tammy Bruce, who has been a feminist. And the first topic that I was, you know, called on to discuss had nothing to do with feminism. Actually, it just had to do with being an atheist. And so he introduces me as an atheist feminist, and they all assume I'm some, you know, leftist, whatever. But I was talking about the atheism. And then he's continued. And, you know, there's been this interesting discussion on James Valiant's thread on Facebook, and I'm not holding you accountable for having read it, but he sees the issue largely the way that I do, that feminism did have an original valid connotation, and that it's the recent wave of feminists that have really destroyed the concept. And what I see, Yaron, is I see what Tucker's doing with some of these appearances that he's having me on, is he's questioning whether the women who call themselves feminists are actually even acting in the interests of women. And so when I've been on actually as a feminist, I have one time disagreed with him because he was saying, well, isn't it in women's interest to shut down this website called Backpage that was arguably allowing women to sell sex services? And I was saying, no, freedom is in the interest of women as well. So I argued as a feminist against shutting down Backpage. And then this time I had an issue where it was just clearly in the interest of women to speak out against allowing transgender females to compete in women's competition. And so then the question is, where are the feminists? And where are the feminists? The feminists are all caught up in their leftist altruism, intersectionality stuff that is making it impossible for them to act in the real rational interest of women. Yeah. So, the way I see it, both historically and today, you do have situations here, but more abroad, I would say, that women are under particular attack. Of course, globally, women still have quite a plight, especially in the Middle East, for example. But here in the US, you can see an example like this transgender story where women are now suffering from the so-called feminists themselves, or the leftist intersectionality that's now associated with feminism.
But that's inevitable, right? I mean, women are going to be the biggest sufferers of feminism. Well,
not necessarily of feminism. So then the question is, can we reclaim feminism? What it originally meant.
But Ayn Rand was very clear, right? Because she wrote about feminism while it was still relatively sane, right? Before third wave or fourth wave or whatever the hell they call themselves today, feminism. She wrote about feminism in the 60s and 70s, and she was against the term even back then.
But what were some of the things that they were arguing for at that point? Because already at that point we had suffrage, and then the other problem is too, right? We also had these anti-discrimination laws and stuff, right?
The what?
The anti-discrimination laws of the 60s were coming into play.
Yeah, but again, those are bad, right? They're not good. Anti-discrimination laws are not good laws.
No.
And again, do you need a term feminism to basically say legally women should be treated as equal citizens, and culturally women should be treated based on, right? Based on their ability.
Only relevant factors.
Sex, right? Only relevant factors. Mm-hmm. Those were the two big issues. The two big issues was one, a civil rights issue, that is, that she'd be treated before the law equally.
Yeah, equality.
And the second one was an issue that culturally there shouldn't be a glass ceiling, and I think there was a glass ceiling. They should be treated based on the relevant factors, not based on irrelevant factors, right? Based on their ability given a particular job. And I don't think, I don't think that you need an ism, right, in order to describe a movement. Imagine if you called, the Black Civil Rights Movement Blackism, right? It's just not a good term. I don't think it's too much of in a sense, a collectivist term. Greg says that, the term back in those days was women's liberation, which I actually find less offensive actually than feminism. Mm-hmm. And given the history, given what it turned out the feminists were actually advocating for, and given what feminists today are advocating for, I don't, it's not a good word. Now, I don't have any problem with Tucker calling you a feminist in this sense that, lots of people on TV call me a libertarian. And I don't correct them, because if you start correcting them on television, then you land up spending the whole time talking about the correction, and you don't land up spending the time when you want it. Now, if they call me a Nazi, obviously I'd correct them. But where it's kind of shady and where
okay, so here's the thing. Let me give you a contrast, right? Yeah. So when you were talking about nationalism, you were talking about that at its inception, nationalism was already polluted and bad. Whereas you could say when feminism was at its inception, it was a good term as far as we know, because the early feminists were asking for equality before the law, and that's it. They weren't asking for all of the other garbage.
Do we know that?
See, yeah, as far as I know, I've been listening to early chapters of Christina Hoff Sommers' book about the history of feminism. And as far as I know, the early feminists from the 1800s, they wanted the right to vote. They wanted women to be able to own property.
Feminists. Clearly, the women's movement back in the 1900s and certainly back in the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century was mainly focused on those civil rights, on
equality before the law.
But the question is, when was the term feminist first used? And was it first used to describe that? I don't think they called themselves, they called it women's suffrage and they called it other things. I don't think they called themselves feminist at that point in time. When did that term come in? And when it came into use, what was it being used? So Christina Hoff Sommers might describe those women as feminists from the perspective of today.
So the question is like, who first described those women as feminists, and would they have described themselves as feminists? And this is the way I think about it. Like if you look at the definition in the dictionary, it says that a feminist is somebody who advocates for the rights and interests of women, which, plug in what you think is appropriate to argue for in that. As I said, I've been on Tucker arguing against taking down Backpage, a website. And then I've argued this time, on behalf of women's sports. But so there's that. The other thing is, insofar as women are subject to particular attack because they are women, maybe
let's
maybe
ask,
there's a term that's useful to fight against that.
Let's ask if such a term is needed today. That is, given that protection before the law is there, if anything, they might be.
Well, not everywhere, right? There's plenty of countries in the world where it's not.
United States, there, and this is where feminists are active. And what's interesting, again, is that feminists.
Some of the best feminists are in France, though. Come on.
What's that?
Some of the best feminists are in France. You know about them, right?
Oh, you mean the topless ones?
Yeah, the ones who go to the Muslim conferences and they protest. Because
but
I am my own God.
Let's take American feminists. The fact is that American feminists today are not interested in women's rights around the world. They indeed, for the most part, hate women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And defend the so-called rights of women in Saudi Arabia to wear burqas and not to drive, by using the term, which I think today is a package deal, right? It's a package deal of maybe it's a package deal, and then it's a question of, is it worth fighting to separate the issues out under that term, feminism? Mm-hmm. It's a package deal of, we want women to be treated equally before the law, and we want the culture to treat equally, not equal, but to treat
appropriately according to the real differences that exist. Real abilities.
Right? So that's part of supposedly feminist. I don't believe it is, because indeed the feminist agenda today.
Well, Christina Hoff Sommers, who's a leading feminist now, believes that it is. I would say Tammy Bruce believes mostly that it is. There's some situations where I would disagree with Tammy.
But they are the exception, they're not the rule. And the rule is that feminists are not. That feminists are pro-Islam. They are they're a collectivist organization, and their primary motivation. And Peter Schwartz wrote this in Return of the Primitive. I mean, their primary motivation is to put down man. The primary motivation is to attack masculinity. And I think if you look, certainly by the numbers, if you look at the majority of feminists, if you look at what feminists write today, the dominant feminists, you can pick some exceptions. You could put
but there's a trend. There's a trend that rejects this. So, for example,
it's not a trend. Again, Peter wrote this. When did Peter write this? Peter wrote this in the 80s. So this has been a long-term.
No, but I'm saying that there is a contemporary trend. So there's Christina Hoff Sommers, and I'll give you another example of Haley Mary, lead singer of Jezebels, very thoughtful woman, and I got to interview her. I waited until the very end of the interview to spring my question on her, because I just was curious, had she read Atlas Shrugged? And she had described herself as a feminist and has a little bit of ecology or whatever. She read Atlas Shrugged. She loved Atlas Shrugged. She said, Dagny Taggart is a badass. And she talks about her struggle with feminism because, and she said this explicitly, that she disagrees with the feminist idea that you reject men or, criticize men or think that men are awful. the war against men, as they call it. She rejects that whole thing, and in fact wrote a song that she would say is sort of her feminist anthem, about how, hey, women are making progress, and no, you don't have to hate men in order to further the interests of women. She came out explicitly against Hillary Clinton, and she is not, herself necessarily an intellectual. She's an artist, but I think that there are a number of thoughtful women who are saying you can advocate for women's interests where it's appropriate and still reject.
By calling yourself a feminist, you're putting yourself in a coalition with some really nasty, horrible, disgusting people. And that's why I don't call myself a libertarian, right? I mean, there's certain libertarians that I think are great. They're really nice people. They do good things, but they're really nasty people. And I don't want to be associated with the really nasty people. And in the umbrella, the big tent that is feminism, they are some really disgusting people. I mean, some of the worst, most anti-Western values, most anti-life people are women in this, I don't know, fourth wave feminist movement or whatever it's called. And to use the same terminology as them confuses, and it's conceptually, I think it's not helpful to use that term. And now you could say we're going to fight for it, like we say about selfishness, but is it worth fighting for? Because I think it's tainted from the beginning, and because it's an ism, it does smack from a certain sense of collectivism, right? So I would just say you can be for women's rights in a sense that we described it without being a feminist. I think that's what Ayn Rand was. I think she advocated for all the right things, but she refused to call herself a feminist. Now somebody says here, Rand made it without feminism, as did Madame Curie, Harper Lee, and many others. But why did they have it so hard being female, right? Yes, they did make it, but their life was harder. And if you look, there's a wonderful show. I don't know how historically accurate it is, but I suspect it's fairly accurate, about Einstein and Einstein's life. And in the show, it describes a number of women scientists who were passed over for credit, including, by the way, possibly Einstein's wife and a first wife, and who were passed over in one case, and I don't think it was Madame Curie, but it passed over for Nobel Prizes because they were women, because the scientific community wouldn't recognize a women. So the idea that everything's always been hunky-dory for women is wrong.
Yeah, let me tell you another story that I just heard recently. I was talking with someone about the issue of transgender females, and this person knew someone who had, gone through transgender treatment, became a female, was a male, became a female, and had been previously successful in business as a male, became a female, and wasn't out as a transgender person. You couldn't tell that this was a transgender female. The person that I talked to said that she had no idea that this was a transgender female until the person told her. This female, transgender female, says that she regrets the decision because since becoming a woman, and again, people don't know she's transgender, since becoming a woman, she hit the glass ceiling in a way that she hadn't when she was a man.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, these are anecdotes that don't prove anything. Now, I'm not questioning a glass ceiling. I truly believe there is a glass ceiling. I truly believe men discriminate against women all the time. So I'm on your side on that part of it. I just don't think anybody should use the word feminism in the current context because of all its negative implications. You can advocate for those ideas without using the term, because I think the term has been, just like I don't call myself people who advocate for free market should be liberals, but we don't use the word liberal because it's been taken, it's gone, forget about it, it's lost. Feminism is no longer a concept that describes what you mean. So if you look at what should be the definition of feminism, what is the definition of feminism?
I mean, this is what you say. If you look it up, it says someone who advocates for the rights and interests.
But that's not how it's used. So that's a dictionary, fine. But how is it used? It's used to promote the hatred of men, to promote the elevation of women above men, to destroy masculinity. That's the way it is used today. And unless you have a chance to differentiate yourself from that, say, no, I believe in a different kind of feminism.
Mm-hmm.
then I wouldn't use the term any more than I would use again. There are a lot of terms out there that you just, even they might have even had a good history, but you won't use them. You're not gonna fight over every term that the bad guys have taken. And even if you think that feminism once was a good term, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know the history.
So what would you call what was the term that you would have if you say, okay, there's someone who is advocating?
I believe in equal rights for women. I believe women should be sure. You don't need a term for it because it's not an ideology. There's no ideology here. And ism is kind of an ideology. There's no ideology here. All you're saying is, I think that women should be treated based on their abilities and their skills. That's it. There's no issue of legally. And in other countries, I believe women should be treated like men. It's a basic issue of individual rights. That's it. Those are the two issues that supposedly that you agree with these feminists on. Fine. Then you don't need an ism to capture those issues. I believe blacks should be treated, so I'm anti-racism, but there's no ism to describe the fact that blacks should be treated based on their abilities, not based on color of their skin, and they should have equal civil rights with everybody else. There's no ism to describe that, and women don't need that ism. And when you create that ideology of women, right, because an ism is an implication of an ideology, you're leading it into a collectivist ideology, which is what I think it's become. It's a collectivistic ideology today. It's about.
Granted, it is a collectivist and in fact an altruistic ideology, and that is being exposed in stories like this one that I was asked to comment on Tucker. Where he says, "Look, where are all the feminists talking on behalf of women's sports? Right? They're not doing that."
But that's because because of intersectionality, transgender are more oppressed than everybody else. But in everything else, women are more oppressed, and therefore women get to oppress everybody else because they have been oppressed historically. So this is the problem when you start using their terminology. How do you escape from the traps that they have created and intersection and feminine?
Selfishness is a huge term that we have to try to reclaim, right? By selfishness, we mean something so different than what everybody else means.
But it's so important. And an ism, I think an ism is something important. There's something important about putting an ism at the end of something. And one really has to evaluate whether something deserves it or not. And I don't think this deserves it in a sense. And I don't think other groups that fight for, like the abolitionists, were abolitionists. There wasn't abolitionism, right? I mean, there wasn't and that was slavery, right? So, I think I'm going to want to interview someone like Christina Hoff-Sommers because she's clearly thoughtful. And she calls herself, as I understand it, an equity feminist, where she, puts herself in. She wants equal treatment before the law. Because equity is what does that mean today? And I just think you're for exactly what you said. You're for women being treated the way they deserve, equally before the law and appropriately in culture. I know what you have to say is anyway. So I don't. And the whole issue of transgender is so complex that I know a man who turned into a woman who is at the height of their career and traveling around the world and doing amazing things. And she's pretty phenomenal. But at the end of the day, it has to screw you up. The whole thing has to cause you to be screwed up in some way or the other. Well, or is it because you're screwed up, or did you hit the glass ceiling because people see you as a woman now? So I think the whole issue of transgenderism is such a complex, and we know so little about it, that it's one of those that I think there's something. Look, it's as Lenin once said, it's not an issue of morality, it's an issue of natural. It's unnatural, which basically means. Well, okay, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. Nobody who approaches transgender therapy in any sort of a reality-oriented way is going to think that he's actually, for example, switched himself into a woman. What I see the person is doing is living life basically, in the most enjoyable way possible. I mean, there are so many variations on the way that people enjoy their lives, especially in the romance and sexual realm, in their bodies on this planet. And here's this medical therapy that they,
can avail themselves of, that nobody reasonable is going to think, oh yeah, I've changed myself into a woman because I've
But there are a
had
lot of
surgery and taken a whole lot of hormones.
But I
it
also
might make a
think,
difference in
but I
quality
feel
of life.
sorry for them. So maybe that's all true, but they can never fully enjoy sex. They can never fully enjoy as a human being.
But maybe they couldn't enjoy it the other way either. I mean, and this is the thing, first of all, the doctor that I spoke with, because I interviewed a doctor who does this, he never would take the decision lightly. You don't have somebody just walk in on a whim and he starts filling them through hormones and stuff. You have to go through a lot of therapy and decide, this is really.
I have, again, based on this one person that I know, I have no fine. But let's not pretend that it's not a sad, distressing, horrible condition to have. It's like somebody has a really nasty disease that they have to live with. And I don't know what causes it. And I don't know that anybody does, but it's not they do the best that they can given the circumstances. Fine. But it is what it is. And it's unnatural, and you can't live a full life as a human being under those conditions, which is unfortunate. It's like being a paraplegic. I mean, it's sad. You do the best that you can under the conditions. You live the best life that you can under the conditions you have, but you're not living as a full life as a human being because of the constraints you're placed under.
I mean, as far as I know, quality of life is tremendously improved for the
could be
particular. But the one thing where you and I clearly would agree, I'm sure, is that any of the ideas of encouraging this in prepubescence,
that's nuts.
Transitioning people before puberty, no way. And that was
anybody before the age of 18 and even it's
even
just
later,
nuts.
I wouldn't. Yeah.
It's nuts. I think that's insane. I think little
but
kids,
that question
why they would is insanity.
That question was really just an aside in the particular issue, because the particular issue was about allowing them to be competing in sports. And I was horrified with the fact that these decisions to allow them to compete in women's sports have been made on so little quantitative data, and quantitative data that points against that being fair in any way, shape, or form. They are destroying women's sports as the rules currently exist. And so this is where you definitely want to stand up for the interests of women in that situation.
Yeah, but it's not, I guess it's in the interest of women, but it is
because women's sports is something that there had to be made a special provision for. There's not a right. There's not a right for anybody to have any sport competition. If somebody said, hey, I want to compete in a pole vaulting competition, somebody better go out and make a competition.
But if somebody wants to include transgender, it's their right as well. So
of course.
The issue is, people should have a right to choose how they want to structure their sports and how it makes most sense to do so. And I think it's horrible what they're doing with transgender in that context.
No, if you want to have athletic competition that women can enjoy the full benefits of athletic competition, including having a real chance of winning and a real chance of losing, and the thrill basically of it, the benefits of exercise, all the stuff that you get from athletic competition. For women to be able to have that, you need to cordon off and say, no, men cannot be here. And for the same reason that men cannot be there, which is that they're significantly stronger, and maybe there's some other things about being a man that give them advantage as well, you also have to say that transgender females cannot either. And, when I was thinking about it, the only way it could potentially be fair, in an athletic sense, would be if they did transition before puberty, which I think would be immoral to do. So the whole thing, it's an interesting topic, but it's sad, right?
Yep. No,
because I would like transgender people to also be able to get the benefits of athletic competition, but you can't mix them in with women if you want women to it.
It's part of you become a transgender, you're excluded from athletic competition. That's life. It's part of the stuff that you're excluded from. That's just the way it is. Or create your own league or do something, but there's no right to compete as a woman.
In dog agility, they've made it so fine grained, the sport that I did, men compete against women, but it's all based on the size of the dogs, right? So the height of the dog tells you what jump height that you have to compete at and stuff. So my dog would compete against all the dogs that jump 16 inches, etc. And they would, make it fair as they could.
Yeah. I think it's a ridiculous topic. Generally, because There's so few transgender people. Let them figure it out in sports wise, and let people who run women's athletic decide for themselves what their governing rules should be. And they should be, I mean, if it's women's athletics, then it should be women's athletics, not transgender athletics.
Yeah, it would. In a
Greg
way,
does say that we do call abolitionism. So there is an ism there. It's worthwhile researching why things are isms versus other things that are not. Yeah. And what does it take to be, what does it take to rise to the level? But I just don't think one should associate oneself with the kind of people who call themselves feminists today.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm very sympathetic with the sorts of stories that they're bringing up because they are challenging those types of feminists, right?
I'm not challenging the issues. I'm challenging the
label.
Identify as feminists. And a vast majority of them, not a small majority, a vast majority of them are pretty bad, are really bad. So, and a collectivist. And I think in that
really, I just got to go join the French feminists then, because they're awesome. But yeah.
Well, maybe, although you haven't asked them about what they think about other stuff.
I know.
They were very mixed.
But at least they're fighting against something real there, mostly.
They are challenging Islamists, whereas American feminists, apologists for the Islamists and attack Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So that, by that standard, I wouldn't want to be labeled one of them, because just by the standard of them wanting to attack Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and so many of them are like that, I think it's a useless term at this point because of how bad.
Well, maybe Christina Hoff Sommers will talk to me, because I'd be interested to.
She probably will, but again, I think some people fight for terms that because they're confused and anyway.
No, I mean, I did that with my dissertation, right? And actually I want to go into privacy a little bit if you will indulge me, please, because there's an interesting op-ed from Wall Street Journal. When I was writing my dissertation on privacy, I wanted to lump myself in with somebody called a reductionist. Reductionists argue that you can reduce all proper cases of a right to privacy being violated to instances in which a violation of a right to property was violated. Yes. And after I got through and got my PhD and everything, I realized, maybe I don't want to lump myself in with these reductionists. And so I ended up publishing a paper called Beyond Reductionism. So there's you want to reclaim a term, say, that's out there. And nationalism is one now that Trump is trying to reclaim and somehow make American. And you talked about why that's not possible. And yeah, maybe in some cases it's not possible. But so here's the op-ed, and it's from Wall Street Journal, Big Brother Isn't Watching You, by Andy Kessler. And he talks about the fact that, right now everybody's so worried about Big Brother, and really Big Brother is not an issue here. It's really an issue in China, where they have the social rankings and all that stuff.
Certainly an issue in China, yes.
Yeah. And he says there's a couple things we need to look at to make sure that it doesn't happen here. One of them is to, eschew regulation, right? Because the more regulation you have, the more that you're going to have government closer and closer to the big Silicon Valley tech companies. And, he also criticizes Apple, because Apple, in effect, is now pushing for regulation and criticizing Facebook and Google, the people who actually make their money off of, data, the use of data.
Yep.
And then the other thing he suggests, and this might sound like a plausible solution, because a lot of times a libertarian will say, if you want to solve a problem, just assign a property right somewhere, let's have a carbon property right. You have the right to emit a certain amount of carbon or whatever, and that somehow is going to solve the whole issue of pollution, for example. And so here he's saying, why not just say that there is a property right in the data itself? And that sounds seductive. And in a way, it even sounds seductive to me, right? Because I've always said privacy is based on property. But when I was thinking about this, I thought that he is either in arguing for a property right in the data, right? He's saying property right in the data itself. He's either arguing for something that will have no effect at all, or if it's something that's going to make a difference, I submit that he is arguing for something that people aren't entitled to. And so if you let me go through those two things for a second. First of all, it maybe just makes no difference at all, right? Because if I have a piece of data or a piece of information, what is the most basic thing that I can do to retain privacy in that data or in that information? I choose not to share it, So if it's an idea in my head, maybe I never say anything about it. Maybe I never write it down. I don't type it in my computer. I certainly don't post it on Facebook. I don't send it in a message to my friend, whatever. You don't share it.
Yep.
So at the most basic level, you have the choice about retaining control over your data. Calling it your property doesn't add anything to it.
Well, unless somebody is snooping and taking it from you, you haven't shared it and somebody steals it from you.
Right. And so then it matters how the person got access to it, right? And so if somebody wants to say, well, no matter how the person got access to that data, we want to somehow assign a property right in that data itself to you, then I would argue that actually what you're arguing for is something that people are not entitled to. So for example, if he wants to have a property right in the data and you share the data with Facebook and there's terms of service and Facebook says, we can make money off of you with your data. Sure. And then he wants to come in and say, no, we're going to assign a property right in the data so that Facebook can no longer make money off of your data.
No, but that's not right.
That's not right at all.
No, but even if the data is your property right, then you can assign, you can still let Facebook make money off of your property.
Right. And that's how it exists even before you would call it a property.
I can lease my land to somebody who's going to build a business on that land and make money off of it.
Right. Right. So the thing that we really need to be looking at is how does Facebook come to acquire the data? In what circumstances? Yes. And so what I see this is
whether you agree to its use or not.
Yes. And that's an issue of contract.
Yes.
And so here he's trying to solve this problem by getting around the issue of how it is, in what circumstances that you actually share the data. How does Facebook come to have the data? I would say that it's because we have a contract with Facebook and that Facebook, pursuant to that contract, is entitled to be making money off of your data. And if the real concern is Big Brother, the problem is not whether or not there's a property right in that data. The problem is that the law says once you share that data with anybody, all the Fourth Amendment protection for it is wiped out.
Yep.
And again, it's the arcane sounding third-party doctrine that nobody wants to hear about because it sounds so abstract and complex or whatever. But if the law says once you share data, there's no longer a warrant requirement about it, and that therefore you're at the mercy of legislators, that is the problem. And you're not going to solve it by assigning a property right to the piece of data, because the doctrine will say, it'll still say, you shared the data, you gave it up.
No, I think that's right. But in the op-ed, he's also arguing that the government is not doing all the stuff that I think the government is actually doing. He thinks everything's siloed, but we know from the IRS case under Obama that it's not so siloed. Mm-hmm. We know from Snowden's revelations on the NSA that it's not so siloed. I know from my visit to the NSA, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that it's not so siloed. Mm-hmm. I don't trust the government. I don't trust them.
Well, and he talks about subpoenas too, and the standard of evidence for a subpoena to be granted versus anything else. It's true that I think the tech companies are being fairly good at scrutinizing the requests that they're getting, and they are pushing back. But their ability to push back is going to be heavily affected by regulation.
And that's the tech companies. What about the telecom companies? What about the AT&Ts of the world? What about the Cox.nets of the world that I use for my cable or whatever? Are they pushing back? I doubt it. And I don't trust the government one bit. I don't trust them with their tax money. I certainly don't trust them that they're not listening in and abusing, abusing these silos and in using them against us. And if they would in an emergency, that they would when the time came to it. I mean, I can imagine, down the road, a Republican administration going after people who support immigrants, right? Who help immigrants get illegally come into the country. And I can imagine on the left going after right-wing groups like the IRS did by interrelating all the data that they have. So I don't trust the government one bit. They have the tools to invade to take our stuff, to invade our privacy in millions of different ways.
Yeah.
And I believe they're using them, or if they're not using them, will use them when the time comes.
And again, the whole problem comes down to this one doctrine, and it's a constitutional law doctrine.
No, I mean, the problem comes down to a lot more than that. I mean, the problem comes down to, because the federal government doesn't care about a doctrine. I mean, that's a big part of the problem.
Well, but it gives them deniability in terms of
deniability. But the real problem is the power we've given the federal government to control our lives. That's the real problem. The real problem is the power lusting. Is the power we've given power lusters to control stuff, and then they have the tools because they have the money to do whatever they want. The NSA is not. I don't worry about the NSA because the third party doctrine. I worry about the NSA because they're beholden to the president, and they'll do whatever he tells them, and they have the tools. Now, maybe it gives them legal protection.
Exactly. Yes.
But I don't think they care, right? What were they? The IRS had no legal protections for what they did. What have been the consequences of what they did, when they denied nonprofit status to right wing? What were the consequences? Zero, zilch, none. So they don't need legal protection because nobody will take them to court. Nobody actually goes after them. They're not prosecuted by the Justice Department. Is part of the government. The Justice Department is not going to prosecute another part of the government for abusing their power because they're all in it together. There's my conspiracy theory for the day. No, but it's true, right? If you're a government employee and you violate the law, what are the consequences? If you're high enough up and if the people above you agree with you politically, then the consequences are likely to be non-existent.
Well, and that's why Snowden said he did what he did, right? Because he was trying to go up the chain of command and was hitting a wall.
And that's why we view him as heroic in spite of some dubious views that he has. But yes, So you're saying even my great solution is not going to make a difference? I mean, no, it'll make a difference at the margin, and it's good to do because it'll get the courts aligned, and a lot of good things will happen for it. But at the end of the day, if power lusters want power, they will take it, and they're not going to need any legal doctrine in order to attain it. They will just take it.
So how are the power lusters doing? Tell me what the election results are looking like.
I'm right, as usual, right?
Okay.
So Republicans are doing much better than anybody expected them to do. It looks like they will. It's now, before it was, what was it, 80-something% that they would keep the Senate. Now it's over 95%. So it's like 95% probably.
Almost certain, yeah.
And it looks like they'll gain some seats in the Senate. But what's really shocking is
Kentucky.
No, what's really shocking is that the House looks like it's going to be a Republican House. You heard it here first, people.
I'm not shocked at that at all.
The House is going to go Republican. So the chances of Republican win control of the House of Representatives is now 60%. It was when we began the evening.
50, right? Or no, 15, I think you said. 15 is what you said, yeah.
It's gone from 15% to 60%.
Okay.
So right now, the Republicans have a 3 in 5 chance of winning control of the House of Representatives, of winning control of the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Now, I have to say, I'm not particularly excited about that because the fact is, Donald Trump is going to be more obnoxious than ever tomorrow morning if this pans out. Sure. And the Republicans are going to be more obnoxious than ever. And, but this is, as I said early on, people underestimate the extent to which Americans are motivated by fear. They underestimate the extent to which Donald Trump is a brilliant marketer and knows exactly which buttons to push to achieve victory. And that I think he will have turned the tide for Republicans, and it looks like Republicans are going to win both houses. It'd be interesting to see how many Senate seats they land up with. But right now, it looks like if there's a wave, it's a Republican wave, and not a wave, but it's a Republican holding the House at this point in time.
If they gain a number of seats in the Senate, that's pretty strong. But
well, let's see what, I'm not seeing any projections with regard to the Senate and the District 6 in Kentucky. is right now with 77% of the votes in is tilting Republican. And they said that if that was going to tilt Republican, then the whole night would tilt Republican. So those who projected that were right. Let's see what they're saying about the Senate. Let's see if there's any. I don't see any real, I mean, other than 538 is now all in Republican winning the Senate, when before it was only 85%. Now it's almost 100%.
Okay.
All right. Ori asks, if we had a voluntary tax system, could government provide welfare morally? No. No. Government can only do what the protection of individual rights requires. There's no such thing as providing welfare morally, because once the government is in a position.
Well, not by government,
because welfare in a sense of the government system, because once the government decides who gets it and who doesn't, who gets it and who doesn't get it, that's immoral. By what standard do they decide? It's my money. So if you want to support a charity, then support a charity. But for the government to do it under any case, no matter what the government funding is, it's the standard by which they give or they don't give is just as important as the fact that they're stealing our money in order to give it, right? All of it is immoral. The whole conception of it is immoral. And it's so libertarians think that the only issue is the initiation of force, but it's not. It's not the only issue. It's what government does. Even if it does it without initiating force, certain things that it does are immoral for it to do, because it's not about just the initiation of force. It's about
it's about what a proper function of government.
What a proper function of government is, and what kind of incentives and what kind of behavior it elicits in people, and again, libertarians tend to conflate initiation with force with immorality. And moral is voluntary. No. Now, moral has to be voluntary, but within the scope of the voluntary, there's lots of stuff you can do that's immoral, right? Just because people agree to something doesn't make it moral. Moral is the rational. Moral is that which is in your rational long-term self-interest, right? And I shouldn't have to say rational long-term. Moral is that which is in your self-interest, properly, fully understood. So most people are not acting morally because they're not considering their self-interest when they're acting, even though most of what they do is voluntary. All right. I think we're good. Whoops, the chances of Republicans winning control is now dropped to 42% from 60%. So some race must have flipped. So it's going to change on a minute by minute basis. Shows how close this is. But one thing I think is clear from this is there's no Democratic wave. There's no this big surge against Donald Trump and his policies. There's
not yet anyway. It could be a long night.
It's not going to be a wave. The Democrats might still win the House, but they're not going to win the House by the kind of margin that the wave theory suggested. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Yaron, for giving me stuff to think about. I will ponder whether feminism is a valid term. We might revisit, but you've given me a lot.
Is it a good term? Is it a positive? Is that term you want to be associated with?
I would say valid, to use or embrace today, right? That's the way I would think.
Let's remind everybody, if you enjoy the show, then share it, subscribe to both our YouTube channels, and of course, support us on Patreon so we can keep doing this. Your support,
it's separate, by the way, people. So if you want to support me, you have to go to my Patreon and do it.
Yes, you can support me by supporting me. So go to Amy's Patreon page. Patreon.com/Amy what? Peikoff? Amy Peikoff. And patreon.com/Yaron Brook Show. And you can please support us, increase your support if you can, but just encourage the support. And good. Well,
I guess I'll be doing news sandwiches until you get back. So I'm probably not going to do a show with you again till December, right?
Yes, I'm off to Europe on Sunday. I'll be in Europe and Israel. I'm doing, 10 events, I think, in the next 2 weeks. in 7 different countries, I think, something like that, including, by the way, everybody should watch the live stream, although it might be very early in the morning for most of you, but you Europeans should watch the live stream of my debate/discussion with Brendan O'Neill about whether Facebook and Twitter and YouTube should be regulated by the government.
Wow.
And the whole free speech issue. And what else was I thinking? Yes, and there's going to be, and those of you in London should definitely go to see the Ayn Rand lecture by Michael Kaufman. So join me at that event. All right. Thanks, Amy. See you in December sometime.
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.